session, and it'll be available after this. So without further ado, I'll introduce Michael Verde, our featured speaker today. Michael, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Happy to be here and to see some familiar faces, not only from last week, but from my time at Sunnyview. So just have a lot of fond memories and just good friends there. And I look forward to being able to get back in person.
All right, we can get started when you're ready, Mike.
Okay, great. Everybody, hello. Good to see you. As I mentioned before, I wanted to just acknowledge a couple of things. One, this series is brought to you in collaboration, obviously, with Sunnyview and Front Porch, but also as part of Memory Bridge, the Foundation for Alzheimer's and Cultural Memory that I founded years ago, 2004, in fact. And Memory Bridge's mission is to end the emotional isolation of people with dementia. And we aspire to do that specifically by bringing people with and without dementia together in one-to-one friendships and just context for fellowship, for no purpose, no greater purpose than the companionship itself. In other words, the folks that come to spend time with folks with dementia are doing so the way one might come and visit a neighbor or an old friend years ago, either in the living room or indeed on the front porch for, as we would said growing up in East Texas, just to shoot the breeze. This might seem like something fairly peripheral in the big scheme of things, but in fact, you can imagine where the desire to share our lives with someone that we trust, someone whose company gives us a sense of just joy, intrinsic joy. How much of the meaning of our life depends upon those kinds of experiences. And so while people with dementia who have entered into residential care may often be receiving really exemplary, you could call it service. They might be receiving exemplary care in many ways, but all too often, and I know this certainly isn't the case at Sunnyview, but all too often, folks, once they are diagnosed and given that label, a person with dementia, while they may still get plenty of attention in many ways, often the kind of attention that I just tried to describe, the attention of two people just entering into a kind of fellowship for no other purpose than the intrinsic joy of one another's company. All too often, that kind of experience becomes increasingly less frequent for people who have been diagnosed with dementia. And as that is obviously not a peripheral kind of experience, namely intimacy, Memory Bridge's mission is to bridge people to one another for that very purpose, because we think that the meaning of all the other forms of care, the care that help assist us in eating, assist us in our daily activities, all of that, which is also an act of love, we imagine that people want to do those things to be alive and to be healthy so that they can experience something that goes beyond just biology. And I imagine that that going beyond biology has something to do with companionship with other people. So I wanted you to understand that this particular series is part of a larger outreach invested in people with dementia not going without the kind of attention that all of us, I am sure, find intrinsically meaningful. I also want to, and if for some reason you're not seeing these slides, please tell me, because I won't know it without hearing from you. Also wanted to acknowledge that this experience is made possible specifically by Richard and Jean Eckert. I had the good fortune of spending time with Jean and to be in her company. And it's because of Jean and Richard's financial support that this experience is able to happen today. And here's several things that appeared in Jean's obituary that I wanted to share with you. But I just wanted you guys to know how much, how grateful I am for Jean. Not only this particular series, but she's enabled it to be possible for us to conduct I Am a Bridge trainings at Sunnyview Cupertino for at least 2 occasions every year indefinitely. That is a rather remarkable gift, and I often just feel a deep gratitude for Jean. Last week, our topic was person-centered care. Specifically, what does person-centered care actually mean? And as you know, for those of you who attended, the principal source of the conversation we had last week was an Englishman by the name of Tom Kitwood. Our conversation today is going to dilate on principles of validation, and the developer, indeed the visionary for principles of validation, is a lady by the name of Naomi Feil. Naomi's been a good friend of mine since, oh goodness, 2005. I hold her in deep esteem. Really, if there was a short list of people who I would say I have my understanding, indeed, of what it means to be human has been affected by my relationship with those people, Naomi would be on that short list. Real quickly, she and her family fled Munich, Germany when she was 4 years old as a refugee from Nazis. In fact, her family learned from a neighbor that they were scheduled to be sent to a concentration camp, and they fled that evening, in fact, and was the beneficence of some nuns who enabled Naomi and her family to make it to America. She grew up in a Montefiore home, which is to say that folks in any really cognitive degree of capacity or incapacity, Naomi relates to those folks as friends. They were indeed her best friends growing up. She was not the most popular girl in school. Indeed, she talks about how her sister was the pretty sister and was sort of adored at school. And she found her source of belonging with the residents in her father's home. And I underscore that because it indicates for me that Naomi's relationship to folks with dementia goes beyond simply that of a professional calling. She identifies with elderly folks at whatever degree of capacity in a deep kind of way. She remarkably graduated with a master's degree in social work from Columbia University. That was no small achievement even now, but certainly not in that day and age. And between 1963 and 80, she developed the method whose principles we'll be discussing today. She's traveled all over the world, Europe, Asia, UK, Australia, many places since the 70s, and has conducted over 200 workshops, and her 4 books have been translated into 12 languages. That's one way to understand Naomi, but I suspect the best way to get a sense of Naomi is to see her in action. So I would like to share with you a brief video from Memory Bridge's first documentary called There Is a Bridge, in which Naomi appears. And what you'll see is her first and only meeting of a lady named Gladys Wilson. And I'll just leave it at that. This is Naomi meeting Gladys. And what you're about to witness is the kind of remarkable, extraordinary rapport that Naomi is able to establish with really anyone. In this case, it just happens to be someone who is experiencing significant cognitive decline. Gladys Wilson, at the time of this meeting, was just 3 months. She had 3 months left before she passed away. So this is a meeting really in the waning days of her life. I need to.
Yeah.
Okay. You guys hear that? Great.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson, hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. You're crying. You have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson with the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, so I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you sing with me? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying and you keep centering yourself, and really look at that person and really mirror their movements. Maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe. You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
I have seen that interaction, I guess, oh goodness, hundreds of times, and it never ceases to move me as if it was the first time I had seen it. And next week we'll return to that interaction and explore it in greater depth. But I wanted to share it with you now for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's the best way to introduce Naomi and what she is all about in this particular context. But two, because I would hazard to guess that of 100 people that entered into Miss Wilson's room, my guess that few, and perhaps as few as 1 of 100, would have participated in that same kind of gift of self that Miss Wilson expressed. In other words, I don't believe that it's inevitable that a person who's experiencing cognitive decline is going to respond in that way simply because a person comes in their room and gets close to them in some physical way. In other words, there was a lot more that was going on in that interaction than simply proximity. And I would further propose the idea that largely what enabled, or at least partly what enabled for that kind of encounter to play itself out in that way, are assumptions that Naomi carried with her into that meeting. In other words, Naomi didn't simply use tools in her toolbox. Rather, she entered into an encounter in which she imagined in advance what might be possible. And that what she imagined reflects a frame of understanding that I want to attempt to communicate to you today, because in the absence of that frame of understanding, I am convinced that Miss Wilson would not have presented herself in such an unmistakably alive way. That there was, in other words, more than techniques that were taking place. There was a mindset that enabled a particular kind of intimacy. And often in my experience, as I go to workshops and learn about quote unquote different approaches, often the emphasis on techniques displaces this deeper frame of understanding, which I am suggesting is absolutely crucial for people with dementia experiencing person-centered care, as any amount of techniques that we might try to associate with that practice. So that is the takeaway here, that you didn't just see actions on Naomi's part. What you saw was somebody that was acting out a frame of understanding that enabled that kind of experience. I can mention, just for what it's worth, that the gentleman that actually was the owner of that particular care community, when he saw this interaction on video, he said to us that he couldn't believe it. Now, he didn't obviously mean that he thought we had rigged or fabricated the images. He simply meant, as he made clear himself, that he had passed by Miss Williams at least once a day for over a year. And never did he once suspect that there was that much life in that woman to be realized. And what he concluded by, after he saw that, he said, I will never pass by another one of my residents again and fail to speak to them as if they were as alive as I am. And I think that is a crucial point to be made here, that if we assume that someone, even someone that is experiencing profound cognitive impairment, if we assume that that person is already gone, then how we communicate with that person is going to reflect that assumption. And in fact, with that assumption in place, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because indeed people with dementia will be gone, but it won't be because there's not something and someone in there waiting to share itself. It'll be rather because of what's going on in our mind, not their brains, that will explain the absence of conspicuous presence. This all too happens with folks with dementia because of assumptions that we harbor, assumptions that prove to be self-fulfilling, that there are millions of people whose lives have simply been written off as someone who is biologically still existing, but is otherwise already moved on to some other place in time because of those assumptions that are firmly in place, even when we don't consciously are aware of it. Because of those assumptions, indeed, people with dementia often are on the long goodbye. But it is not, again, I'm suggesting, because of what's going on neurologically or what's going on otherwise in their brain, but rather what's going on in our mind. I hope after our conversation today that we will both be persuaded by a frame of reference that makes possible what can appear to be miraculous, which may, however, be very, very ordinary if we allowed it to be ordinary. Okay, this is the first principle of validation. I realize that phrases to the right there are probably not clear. So what we're going to do now is briefly unpack those equations. The first equation there, I put NI, that is shorthand for neurological impairment or neurological impact. And what the claim is there is that neurological impact does not equal behavior. I stress that because in my experience, this is the working assumption of the vast majority of people, including the vast majority of people who are professionally invested in the care of persons with dementia. Most people assume, whether they're conscious of it or not, that what they see as behavior reflects neurological impairment, that there is something like a one-to-one relationship between what's going on with neurons and what's going on in that person's actions or lack of actions. I'm going to suggest that that is a profoundly crippling assumption and is simply not scientifically sustainable. The alternative, let's say, equation that I'm going to propose for both of our consideration, excuse me, is that neurological impact indeed is relevant, but to that we have to add a context of meaning in order to understand behavior. And it's that context of meaning that I want to explore with you, what that means and why it matters more particularly. So here you go. These are elements in the context of meaning. Real quickly, if a person trips over a root, let's say a person's out for a walk and there is a root breaking through the cement and a person trips over it, it may very well happen that that person falls. And in that sequence of events, we can say that the root caused the fall. There's a cause and effect relationship between hitting the root and then perhaps hitting the concrete. But we cannot say the same in this scenario. Let's say that a person, intentionally or unintentionally, is pushed by another person and happens to fall. What we cannot understand as a cause and effect relationship is how that person responds to his or her fall. One person who falls, whether by a root or by being pushed, will respond to it by saying, "Oh, goodness gracious, what a silly thing to have happened. Klutzy me," or "There you go, X happens and then you die." One person might say, "Goodness, this city is really remiss for not keeping up with these sidewalks." Another person might feel extremely self-conscious and wonder who's looked on and seeing them in such a embarrassing light. In other words, how we respond to that cause has to do with the way we make meaning of the experience. And why that is important is this: because dementia does not have a cause and effect relationship with behavior, because in between the impact of neurological damage, there is the space of meaning in which people respond to their condition. All of that to say is that the behavior of people said to have dementia or with dementia, the behavior of folks with dementia involves the meaning that a person is making of his or her life, not simply reflecting what is going on with neurons. Between the neurons and the behavior is a context of meaning. Understanding this will enable us to give a more life-affirming and indeed life-inviting kind of attention to people with dementia, because we will have to take into consideration the meaning that is involved in this particular encounter or in these particular behaviors. When Naomi stepped in the room to meet Miss Wilson, she knew that she was not just meeting someone who was going to act out a bunch of behaviors based on neurons. She knew that she was encountering a person who would have reasons for the way that she responded to Naomi, not simply causes. I hope that is clear. I'm trying to make it as starkly evident as possible because it is a significant concept in what we call person-centered care. We have to assume, because indeed it is the case, that what we consider or see as behaviors are partly, if not principally, influenced by the meaning that a person with dementia is trying to make of his or her life. We are not simply bodies that are responding to our neurons. We are meaning-making creatures, and when things happen to us, including biologically and neurologically, what we do reflects partly the meaning that we're making of our situation. So here are some contributing factors to the context of meaning. Number one, all people have developmental histories, which is to say all people have different past. They have experienced different things. They've had different kinds of relationships. They have responded to the events in their life in different ways. Some have grown in one direction, others have grown in another direction. Our developmental history interacts inextricably from our behavior. If you try to understand a behavior without taking into consideration that particular person's past, you are almost certainly going to misunderstand their behavior, because how we act has much to do with the experience in our lives that have brought us to this particular moment. That seems to be straightforward and unobjectable enough, and yet paradoxically or ironically or even unfortunately, many people, including within the field of dementia care, are unaware that developmental history is a major impact on behavior. Number two, a person who is said to have dementia is experiencing manifold physical changes, not simply the death of neurons or the accretion of protein deposits in between their synapses. There are other kinds of life changes that can be considered physical that are happening in folks with dementia's life and folks without dementia life. We can think of, off the top of our head, physical changes. People's body is aging and aging in different ways. There are any number of kind of circulatory changes that might be affecting mobility. There are impacts to hearing. There's impacts to sight. There are osteoporosis perhaps, or arthritis. You can imagine any number of things that are going on that can't be said to be dementia that isn't also impinging on a person's behaviors. I want to underscore the loss of hearing because it is a significant impact that often goes unrecognized. When folks can't hear what's going on or can't hear well, there's any number of ways that they may respond to that. One way they may respond is to retreat from social interactions because they're not actually keeping up with the flow and they don't want to make social mistakes. Depression, for instance, is a physical kind, or can be a physical kind of change that takes place that impacts our behavior. Over 40% of people with dementia are said to have clinical levels of depression. A significant number of people with dementia are experiencing anxiety. This anxiety, like the depression, impacts people's behavior, but it is not the same as dementia. Another way of saying that is if there's a person with dementia in our life who is experiencing depression, and because of our interaction with them, their depression diminishes, it's going to change that person's behavior. In fact, it may change that person's behavior in dramatic ways, and that would have been achieved without finding a cure to Alzheimer's disease or otherwise introducing some medicinal intervention. We would have eliminated the depression. And similarly with anxiety. And let me stress, because it's absolutely vital in this context to point out that emotional isolation, typically thought of as loneliness, can cause depression and can cause chronic anxiety. Another way of saying that is much of the behaviors that we see of people with dementia reflects the fact that they're living in emotionally isolated kinds of existences. And when folks are in that kind of condition, emotionally isolated, you're going to see behaviors that reflect any number of things, including a desire to no longer be in that condition. For instance, it is said that people with dementia wander. And then if we're not careful, we'll just say, yep, that's some wandering. And yet we might not ask ourselves, what might that person be seeking? It's very likely that the quote unquote wanderer is seeking a kind of attention, a kind of companionship that he or she is not finding. And so what we might describe as a symptom called wandering might be a very reasonable response to a very understandable, unsurvivable condition related to the relationships or lack thereof in a person's life. So in addition to what's going on with neurons, there are other physical changes that are impacting what we call or think of as behavior. In addition to physical changes, there are social changes. At a certain age in life, family members that were once sources of support for us are no longer immediately available or available at all in a kind of physical way. We may no longer be performing the kinds of and contributing socially, vocationally, or in a volunteer capacity, or in any number of kinds of avocations that might have been important to us. There are, in other words, activities that we once participated in that we're no longer participating in now. There also comes the reality that at a certain age, if we live in a certain cultural ambiance, that people around us will begin to perceive us differently simply because we've achieved a certain degree of maturity. In other words, if you live in a cultural space in which people have ageist attitudes or think of old people as in some way less than people, well, that too constitutes a kind of social reality that can impact, and indeed impact decisively, on a person's behavior. So in addition to the fact that we all have different histories that affect our behavior, people with dementia are all experiencing other kinds of physical changes, and people with dementia live in a world in which social changes have put them in a very different place with respect to how they understand their place in the world. And finally, there are existential needs that are absolutely involved in a person's behavior. A short and pithy way of saying that would be to say that one of our needs is to belong in matter in life. We are meaning-making creatures and purpose-seeking creatures. If for some reason we find ourselves bereft of meaning or without a purpose, it's going to have a profound impact on our behavior. It's going to affect, one, our way of seeing the world, but it's also going to affect us even physically and biologically. You know, there's a interesting phenomena with respect to persons with dementia and the dementia experience more generally, that after a catastrophic loss, many people will evince conspicuous symptoms of dementia that was not evident before that loss. This often happens when a spouse passes away, or a child that one was, well, a child in one's life, a person that can experience that kind of loss. The next thing you know, they're exhibiting symptoms of what is considered dementia. Well, the fact that those symptoms are following upon that kind of catastrophic loss suggests that that behavior is partly in response to a life event and not a neurological condition. So the point to be made here is, when we are in the company of someone with dementia, if we imagine that everything that person does or says or doesn't do or say is reflecting what's going on with their neurons and only their neurons, then we're going to have a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that we are seeing and hearing in that person's life. And what is good news, why that is good news to me, is that while there is not anything I personally can do about the neurological changes in a person's brain, there is much that I can do in the life world of someone that I care about, whether or not they have dementia. In other words, these other kinds of changes are things that we can influence in our contributions to the environment in which people with dementia live. And of all of the facets of that environment, I want to propose to you that there's no facet more important than our interpersonal environment. Let me say this again, that the most important factor in our behavior as humans, period, and there is nothing about the term "a person with dementia" that changes the fact that we're talking about humans, period, that the number one factor in our behavior is the nature and the quality of the relationships that we are experiencing in our lives. That to me is good news, because again, although I may not be able to make an impact on neurons, I can make an impact on the environment in a person's life, because I can be a part of that environment. Okay, I want to share with you several principles of validation. Number one, that all people are unique. In other words, when Naomi stepped in the space to meet Miss Wilson, she harbored the conviction that all people are unique. Consider what that would mean in this context. When Naomi stepped into the room to meet Miss Wilson, she understood that she was meeting a person for which there was at some point absolutely no way to predict what that person was going to do or say, because in some sense, no one like Miss Wilson had ever existed before. And that there was nothing about her cognitive impairment that in one iota diminished her uniqueness. Naomi did not imagine she was stepping into a room to meet a type of person. She was stepping into a space to meet Gladys Wilson. That is a huge difference in mindset. All too often when we encounter people who happen to have dementia, we imagine that we're about to meet a person with dementia, forgetting that that person is in no way finally reducible to the category of a person with dementia. Number two, principle of validation is that real change comes from the inside out. Now, what that means in practical terms is that if we imagine that we're going to extrinsically mold someone's behavior to a satisfying expression, we are about to enter into what will ultimately be an emotionally and spiritually unhealthy relationship. Think about the very term tools in one's toolbox. I stress this because it is a ubiquitous phrase in the education of caregivers. I can't tell you how many workshops or conferences that have billed their value by suggesting that if you attend this experience, you will walk away with tools in your toolbox. I'm sure people don't mean anything nefarious by that metaphor, but it doesn't take much unpacking to realize what is implied. Tools are what we use to manipulate objects. I want to just pause there because that assumption is actually the prevailing assumption in most people's imagination with respect to people with dementia, whether or not they acknowledge it. There is something about that term that persuades many of us to recategorize a person into the status of an object or perhaps some kind of animal. In other words, the very idea that a person has dementia in many people's minds recategorizes them into something less than a person. And if we assume that when we come into the presence of a person, imagine how that can prove to be the most deleterious variable in that person's interpersonal environment. In other words, if we walk into a person's life world with that assumption about that person, we have just introduced a toxic element in their lives. And it will be us ourselves who are the toxic element. This is, I would think, as unobjectionable as anything. If we imagine infants and we imagine a mother, even a mother who tried to follow by the book every single technique about raising a child and yet never interacted with that child in an intimate way, it's inevitable that that child is going to experience psychological and emotional problems. Why? Because that child lacks a kind of recognition that he or she absolutely needs to be human. This is obvious to us for infants. This is obvious to us for people at every age of their lives. But for some reason, when we add the category of person with dementia, for no ill intent whatsoever, that obvious fact can sometimes disappear entirely from our frame of reference. The third principle of validation is that empathy builds trust and trust inspires growth. Again, the analogy of an infant is perfectly, I think, applicable, not because people with dementia are infants, but because we are all have been infants and our experience in that space continues to reverberate throughout our lives. If a child does not experience a secure attachment with a primary caregiver, the absence of secure attachment, it has been demonstrated in any number of ways, is going to negatively impact that child's life in many, many ways. In other words, many people lack a sense of secure attachment to another person. And this very much happens in the context of people who have dementia. They are seeking a kind of attachment that they're not finding in their life worlds. You can imagine, at least it seemed evident to me, that in the interaction of Naomi and Gladys, excuse me, I'm trying to see you, and in the interaction of Naomi and Gladys, at least as I witnessed it, there was a period there where it seemed to me that Miss Wilson was trying to decide if she could trust Naomi. How many people have interacted with Miss Wilson that proved to not be trustworthy? In other words, is this person really interested in me? There appears to be somebody that is wants to make a connection with me, but do they really want to make a connection, or are they just trying to get me my medicine? Are they just trying to get me to the dining room area in the most efficient way? Does this person really care about me? Are they really interested in me as a person? I'm guessing that at a certain point, Miss Wilson decided in her heart that the lady who was before her cared about her. And in the establishment of that trust, I think we saw what we saw that followed thereafter. In other words, it was because Miss Wilson trusted the sincerity and authenticity of Naomi's presence, that she opened herself up in a way that I'm guessing would not have happened had she interacted with people who she did not trust were sincerely and authentically invested in her as a person. These, at one level, seem to be the most obvious things that one could say, and yet for some reason they need to be said, because they are not simply translating into best practices of care in many instances. Here are a few psychological assumptions that Naomi also brings to bear in the validation practice that you witnessed. Naomi is convinced that if we have feelings in our life, especially painful feelings, if those feelings are not acknowledged by a trusted listener, they will not diminish. In other words, we have feelings going on in our life world, and this is as true for people with dementia as without, that if they're going to subside in their intensity, need to be shared with at least one person that we trust. Number two, that this is a psychological assumption or assumption about people's interior worlds, that we have well-established emotional memories that never disappear from us or to us. As William Faulkner said, the past is not past. Often you'll hear someone say, yeah, but she lives in a kind of fantasy world because she still believes that her mother is alive, or she still believes that her husband is alive. Well, what Naomi would say is that emotionally, her mother still is alive. Emotionally, her husband still is alive. And it's not because she's a person with dementia, it's because she's a person. And that all of us are having relationships with people who are not immediately present if those people are of emotional consequence in our life, that those emotional feelings are a part of reality and should not be understood as delusions or merely symptoms. A third psychological assumption of validation is that when present reality becomes painful, some of us will seek to restore balance in our life by orienting to the past. Consider if you're in a space in which you do not feel that a single person cares about you. If you're inhabiting a life world where you don't believe that you belong or matter to even a single person, can you imagine anything that is more absolutely excruciatingly painful to a human being than to be biologically alive and yet not feel that a single person cares about you for who you are and not simply because they are fulfilling a task called caregiving? I can't imagine anything more painful than that, existentially speaking. And what Naomi would say is, not only is that painful, it's unbearable feeling. And that a way that a person can attempt to self-medicate so that that feeling goes away is to retreat into a world where he or she still does belong and matter. If in what is called reality, I no longer belong and matter, then I can say to you that perhaps it's not reality that I most need. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Often what we're calling a behavior as if it was a reflection of neurological changes is an absolutely perfectly understandable human effort to still feel that one belongs and matters. That in fact, what we're calling a symptom makes perfect psychological sense if we take into consideration that a human being is a purpose and meaning-seeking creature, and that the meaning of our life is not simply to pass for being in the reality of the people around us. We need more than just that kind of clock or calendar reality. Finally, this is a psychological assumption that human beings have many levels of awareness. Now, the reason why this is important is because often we will not appreciate the depth of actual understanding that a person with dementia is participating in or that maintains. So, for instance, a person can at one level imagine that he or she is talking to a parent, and yet at another level know absolutely perfectly that that parent is no longer alive because this person participated in their burial. You might be able to coax someone to go along with the illusion that their mom is about to visit or something along those lines, and they may go along with you because that's at some level feels good, but at another level, a person is aware of more than what it is that they might be revealing to you. And I think this should be self-evident because all of us, I think, would agree that we have a awareness at many, many different levels, and that we should never underestimate just how much people with dementia do understand is going on around them. In fact, if you have to make one assumption or the other, this is what I tell myself: assume that there is more understanding than less. Either way, we're making an assumption. One of those two assumptions can lead to what we saw happen between Miss Wilson and Naomi Fowle. A different assumption, and we would have never seen that kind of self-expression from Gladys Wilson. Now, one way to encapsulate into a kind of visual metaphor of everything that I propose for us, for both of us to consider, because I too am learning and continue to learn from Naomi and from the people who I get to know that happen to have cognitive impairment all the time. So I want you to know that I'm not offering the things I'm sharing as some kind of expert, but rather as a student. And I think that's a very healthy posture to take to things that we simply don't understand entirely. You know, if the mind was simple enough to be understood, we would be too simple to understand it. We simply must assume that when it comes to the reality of a human being, that there is infinitely more that we do not know than that we do know. And I would propose for myself that I move forward with that assumption of not knowing, because it will certainly make me more alert to learning. In any case, the picture and image you see on the screen now is to connote the idea that I do not have a me without you. Another way of saying that is that every individual I lives in a context of we. I mentioned last week that if I challenged you or myself to go in the mirror and to see myself, that I simply could not do it. I might see my nose, I might see my eyes, I might see anything, but what I would not see is myself. In other words, myself is not my nose. Myself is not my eyes. What is this thing called the self? We imagine that we know what it is with a great enough confidence to say that some people have lost their self. Well, I would be, in other words, very, very careful to hazard that kind of assumption that a person has lost him or herself when we can't even say that we've seen a self. In other words, in this world in which evidence-based practices are given such a high degree of valiance or salience, no one, I'm suggesting, has empirical evidence that a self exists, if they mean by empirical evidence, because they've measured it or they've seen it. All of that to say this: the only way I catch a glimpse of myself is in your face. I don't know. I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. I hope that makes at least this much sense, namely that I do not know who I am without being in a relationship with other people, and how I come to perceive myself has everything to do with the me that other people reflect back to me. If people reflect back to me that I'm a person of value, that my life matters, that I belong, then I am going to see that myself. If, however, it's reflected back to me in any number of conspicuous and inconspicuous, which is to say overt or covert ways, that I'm no longer meaningful, well, then that's the self I'm going to come to believe that I am. This, I think, is absolutely something that cannot be objected to. I'm just thinking, in other words, that we would all agree to that. If indeed that is an assumption, imagine what the consequences are for how it is that we understand care. I want to conclude by trying to bring that into a final kind of, let's just say, illumination. If we imagine that care involves meeting a person's biological needs and meeting them perfectly only, then our understanding of care is simply not caring enough. I'm suggesting that in addition to all the instrumental needs that all of us have, we have another need that's even more primary, the need to be recognized. And I don't mean recognized because we appear in the paper or someone gives us a retirement watch. By recognition, I mean that we can see in another person's face that we matter and that we belong. This is a need, I'm suggesting, that runs as deep as food and water. And if we live in a care environment in which we receive food and water and every other thing of biological consequence, but we don't see in the faces around us that we belong and matter, then I'm going to say for me that that person is experiencing not only something that is less than optimal, I would say something that is actually morally horrifying. And I would further hazard, without trying to be negative, but simply to assess where we are as a people culturally, that far too many people who happen to have been given the label a person with dementia live in what might be considered exemplary conditions, including the conditions of care, in every way except this primary way of seeing in the faces around us that we belong and matter. Now, I offer all that not to be dispiriting, but because I think it is wonderfully good news with very concrete action steps implicit in it. Namely, that we can begin to do something for the lives of people with dementia long before there's a discovery of a miracle cure. We need not wait to impact the lives of people with dementia for some technological solution to come down from Valhalla. That everybody in this conversation today, by virtue of being human, is qualified to participate in ending whatever suffering, unnecessary suffering that people with dementia experience because of emotional isolation. Now, we have just scratched the surface. I hope if you haven't seen last week's presentation, not because it's so wonderful, but rather because it introduces principles that are important for this adventure that we're on together. If you haven't seen last week's presentation, I hope you'll take advantage of the recording available to you. Those of you who aren't able to be here with us in person today, I hope you will also have seen this through a recording. And I look forward to seeing you a week from today as we look at some of the explicit techniques. I have in many ways de-emphasized techniques because often people will imagine that they're miracle solutions. But techniques are of value. You could imagine that some things that Naomi was doing with Gladys were techniques of her method called validation. We will explore those techniques next week. We will also look at this interaction again and another interaction between Naomi and a person with cognitive impairment. Everybody, I want to thank you. I want to thank Sunnyview. I want to thank Richard and Jean Eckert, and I want to thank you for contributing such good energy. I've picked up on it vicariously because it's been part of the environment in which I've experienced this particular presentation. I look forward to seeing you a week from now. Bill, thank you for everything. See you soon.
Thank you, Michael. And for those of you who want the video, please email me and I'll get that to you. My email is bpenrod, which is PENROD @frontporch.net. And we'll send you last week's video as well as this week's video. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, Michael. Always inspirational.
Thank you. Good